All right, ZenGlop the Podcast, episode 41. Episode 41. It's Sunday, January the 6th, 2019. Got my YouTube video going here again. And just as a reminder, on www.zenglop.net, follow the link for the newsletter, sign up for the newsletter. I'm trying to build that up as a way to keep updates coming about new music or new podcast episodes or other projects and what have you that's going along. It's a pretty quiet day here in the ZenGlop studio. The holidays are officially over. We had our big Epiphany party last night, which is one of our annual events. We go bring in the world and have one last hurrah after the Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's festivities. It's a pretty good time, but it's quiet and reflective today as everyone kind of moves back into the regular routine. So I have a book that I've been reading that Catherine gave me for Christmas. Is called Earth Sound, Earth Signal by Douglas Kahn, and it's a really interesting book about natural radio and how natural radio has been used as material for composition, electronic music composition, how it has inspired electronic music composition, and how it's inspired even an aesthetic form and medium in its own right. So what is natural radio? Well, natural radio you can think of as being the electromagnetic activity associated with the Earth or with the cosmos. In this case, with the Earth's atmosphere or the electromagnetic field of the Earth itself. And the book starts with a really interesting perspective on how we first started to hear these signals, because it ties in with the development of the telegraph and the telephone, with the long charged wires spread across the surface of the Earth for miles, naturally received or picked up the storm activity, solar storm activity, lightning strike activity associated with the Earth. And this was recognized by the early telegraph operators, who were able to see or experience the storm activity through their wires. But then when the telephone, a microphone was attached to that wire so we could start to hear deliberate sounds on those wires, it was possible to actually be immersed in this electromagnetic ambience or atmosphere. So Thomas Watson, the book starts with several chapters about Thomas Watson. Watson was Edison's engineer. And even in the early days, when the telephone wire was only a test wire that was maybe a half a mile across a plant somewhere or down the street, Watson wrote extensively about the sounds that he heard. And those sounds, we now have a taxonomy of them. They're called whistlers. You might hear it called the dawn chorus. But there's a recognized or recognizable set of sounds that you can hear if you have a big piece of wire with a microphone or an earpiece attached to it that allows you to hear what's being picked up. So that's natural radio. And there's some interesting points that Douglas Kahn raises about transmission versus inscription, which is part of the book. Part of the book is talking about aesthetic action with radio. And so I think there's a distinction being drawn between recording sounds and transmitting sounds, like inscription versus transmission. Now he moves to the composer that he spends most of the time in with the book is Alvin Lucier, who used these whistlers as source material in some of his pieces, but he also used brainwaves as control elements, right? So it wasn't just a question of what we would consider sampling now and manipulation of the sound, but actually using these electromagnetic events as controls that could maybe be used to strike percussive instruments, or could be transduced and amplified and then actually heard as part of the piece. And that idea of transduction is another important point early on in the book, to make sure that it's clear that there's a difference in quality between sound waves, like my voice or an acoustic instrument, and these electromagnetic frequencies that we can hear. So he talks about, I think, a very useful distinction when we talk about transduction. Transduction is a shift in energy. It's the movement of energy either in degree or in kind. Right? And if we think of 2 points, like a mechanical sound and electromagnetic sound. So mechanical sound doesn't mean machines or diesel engines or stuff like that. It means energy that requires a physical medium to be perceived, like sound requires the particles of air to be heard. So when we hear the wind, we aren't actually hearing the wind, right? We're hearing the wind transduced through some physical object, whether it's a tree or a building or a piece of paper, something. That's a transduction of degree. The wind is moving the particles in the air, but we require some additional element to amplify or exaggerate or represent that sound in a way that we can hear. The sound of trees being blown by the wind is a good example. Right? It's not the wind that we're hearing, it's the trees being manipulated or excited by the wind. So that would be transduction of degree within the mechanical realm. But then if we have electromagnetism, we aren't physiologically oriented to actually perceive electromagnetism, certainly not through our ears. So we need some technology or a tool to transduce electromagnetism into an actual different state, a different energy state, from electromagnetism into mechanical sound. And that's what happens with radio or with a receiver, where the electromagnetism of the different waves are then transduced into something that causes a speaker to vibrate, and then we can hear it. When you hear recordings from NASA, for example, of the sound of Jupiter as a probe flies by, well, it isn't truly the sound of Jupiter that we're hearing, right? Because first off, it's an electromagnetic transmission. Second, there's a vacuum in space, so there's no sound as we know it. But these electromagnetic pulses associated with Jupiter, or think of a pulsar. You can hear the sounds of pulsars because that electromagnetism is transduced from one form of energy into another. So I'm going on about this a bit because it's an interesting distinction, and it's an important one for the point of Kahn's book, and it's also an interesting one for some of the work that I do. So if you look in the YouTube channel for a playlist called The Urban Bellaboke, that's kind of my exploration of electromagnetism, except where the early pioneers, or this early material, is based on natural radio that is caused by atmospherics and the electromagnetic structure of the planet. In the modern urban environment, we are surrounded by human constructs of electromagnetism. It's actually really difficult to hear whistlers and spherics because you have to be a distance away from any electrical activity that's generated by the human grid, because they operate at the same frequency and the human grid overpowers it. And one of the points I make in the Urban Belleboke as I walk around with my antenna is that, at first I was enormously frustrated that I couldn't record the beautiful sounds of spherics and then use those in my music. But at a certain point, I just shifted perspective. Well, the fact is that the drones and the hums and the harmonies that happen when I walk down the street outside or stand in front of a building with my receiver, the very low frequency receiver tuned down to that 60 hertz range, the sound is compelling and beautiful in its own way. It's a question of accepting that that's what the material is, rather than what I had hoped it to be, where if I'd been out in the middle of the desert with Lucier and a big coil of wire, I could hear the cosmos, but I can't hear the cosmos, but instead I can hear Duquesne Light, which is the local energy provider. Or it's really astonishing the nuances of sound, or of electromagnetism through sound if you stand by a traffic signal. For example, as the lights change, the frequency changes. It's interesting. So I'm sort of predisposed to like this and to get into this book as a field of study. And what I was particularly struck by, right? He talks about Thomas Watson, but at the same time he talks about Thoreau and Walden, because in Walden, Thoreau talks about the telegraph wires as an aeolian harp. So aeolian is an ancient term for an ancient instrument, long strings tuned that are left to be vibrated, made resonant by the vagaries of the wind or the vagaries of other atmospheric or environmental cases. But the idea that there's a chime of some kind that is tuned but not played. Right? What plays it is the wind. Think of wind chimes on your back porch. That's kind of an aeolian instrument. Imagine if you had a harp or an old piano body stuck out in the field. As the wind blew over it, you would hear the strings vibrate. That's aeolian. A-E-O-L-I-A-N. Aeolian. I actually saw recently a piece of architecture on the coast somewhere, I think on the Black Sea, somewhere interesting. But it had been constructed so that underneath the boardwalk where people walked were tunnels shaped and carved and tuned so that as the waves broke in and sort of pushed the air through them, they would resonate at particular pitches. So this entire section of the coastline has this aeolian style instrument where the energy of the water is transduced into sound. So aeolian is the transduction within the mechanical realm. And Thoreau was captivated by the sound of the telegraph wires that had been stretched in the deep cut next to Walden, along the same place where the trains would come. And there are sections in Walden where he describes the sound of the wind in the telegraph pole, the wind in the telegraph wires. And he talks about the idea then of so he's got the immediate experience of hearing the wind in the telegraph wires in that specific deep cut next to Walden, but then he visualizes or imagines all of the telegraph wires across the United States forming this one enormous aeolian harp. And so this sort of ecstatic view of technology side by side with his qualms and concerns about the actual execution of the technology, but if it's seen as a human artifact separate from commerce and the constructs that it's applied to in daily life, he has this glorious vision of this Aeolian mechanics spreading across the world, far exceeding the capabilities of the ancient world. It's something uniquely modern, uniquely American. When I read Walden last year for the first time since high school, for the first time for 20 years, and even when I was a boy and had read it, I don't think I read the whole thing. I think because my recollection of Walden was the bean counting part, the notion that Thoreau spent time detailing how many beans he planted and how much he hoed the ground and how much it cost him to get the wood to do this and everything. So that element of Walden. But when I read it recently, the truly transcendental part of it really struck me. That this idea of a perspective of the world where elements of nature demand attention, or elements of mankind, humanity, interacting with nature, but in this plenary, this plenum of humanity that is separate from the commerce. So I was reading Earth Sound, Earth Signals, Douglas Kahn book, and he talked about the Aeolian energy, and he quoted bits of Thoreau, and it reminded me that when I read Thoreau, when I read Walden, I highlighted a lot, but I highlighted several pieces in the chapter called the ponds. So this is not now Earth Sound, Earth Signal. This is now prompted by the thinking, or prompted by the reading of Thoreau and Walden as a visionary, ecstatic document, right? As a documentation of a particular stance that is a step removed from the day-to-day human activity, but applies a view, or applies a vision to the artifacts of humanity, particularly the technical, industrial, mechanical pieces that spread out across the globe. So the chapter talks about two lakes within the area around Concord. Now there are many lakes, but Thoreau, of course, first is deeply connected to Walden itself. And then he also highlights a second lake that's, I think, 9 miles away, called White Lake. And these two lakes are each described in great detail, both from a geological perspective. Thoreau spends time canoeing on the lakes. He's very aware of the depth soundings of each of them. But it's particularly striking that the color, description of the color that he uses for each of the lake ends up with this gem-like description. So Walden, he actually refers to the color as the color lying between heaven and earth, with this indescribable light blue. And you read this and hear it, and you can feel this synesthetic sense of the color applied to the lake. So the capturing of that color in words is almost a physiological need for Thoreau, right? Like when he has this, the white pond he describes as a distiller of celestial dew, and that it is a fit study for a Michelangelo, this indescribable quality of the light with it reflected in the ponds and changeable over time based on the environmental circumstances of the day or of the season or of your position, whether you're up looking down, or whether you're in the water or next to the water. This the preciousness, and he actually uses the word precious to my eye to describe the quality of the water. He says, this is a quote from the chapter, "A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature. It is Earth's eye." So the earth, the eye of the earth. But he also, in the same section, describes how the person looking at the lake is exposed to themselves, figuratively, but literally in the sense of the reflection in the water, but figuratively in the sense that in order to really experience the lake, you have to step outside the constructs of yourself as a human, a human engaged in commerce or the grind of day-to-day life or the decisions of your limited ego. Step aside from that, the lake becomes this jewel. And there's a poem here. I'm going to read the poem. Get to the page, the necessary page. It's a poem that actually reminds me of William Blake, where William Blake talks about eternity in a grain of sand. And also William Blake requires that you look at the machinations of the urban environment, particularly London, and see the celestial city, right? See an imprint of, in Blake's case, see Jerusalem imprinted on the city. Thoreau isn't talking about Jerusalem, he's talking about, like I say, I keep using the word ecstatic, this ecstatic explanation of the plenum of experience through the apperception of the attributes of the lakes. So here's the poem. It is no dream of mine to ornament a line. I cannot come nearer to God and heaven than I live to Walden even. I am its stony shore, and the breeze that passes o'er. In the hollow of my hand are its water and its sand, and its deepest resort lies high in my thought. And a poem is kind of the end of a section where he's talking about how all of the change is in the person who is looking at the lake. Here he said, I'm just going to read this whole paragraph. Nevertheless, of all the characters I have known, perhaps Walden wears best, and best preserves its purity. Many men have been likened to it, but few deserve that honor. Though the woodchoppers have laid bare first this shore and then that, and the Irish have built their styes by it, and the railroad has infringed on its border, and the icemen have skimmed it once, it is itself unchanged, the same water which my youthful eyes fell on. All the change is in me. It has not acquired one permanent wrinkle after all its ripples. It is perennially young, and I may stand and see a swallow dip, apparently to pick an insect from its surface as of yore. It struck me again tonight, as if I had not seen it almost daily for more than 20 years. Why, here is Walden, the same woodland lake that I discovered so many years ago. It is the same liquid joy and happiness to itself and its maker, and it may be to me. It is the work of a brave man, surely, in whom there was no guile. And then he writes the poem. As an aside, I wonder if Herodotus would agree with that. Maybe we should think about that a bit more. Where Herodotus talks about never being able to step into the same river twice. Thoreau is saying that Walden is unchanging. I wonder if there's an interesting contradiction or friction between those two ideas there. Maybe something to think for a future podcast. Let me put a note here in the book. I'd already written Walden is timeless, and I'm going to say, but what about Herodotus? What indeed? So those ponds, right? This stance is an important concept, I think, right? It's one that Um, the idea that you can be compelled or impelled, propelled, impelled, propelled to a different stance where your view, my view of an object, drops away from it the initial intent. So I'm thinking specifically now about like the telegraph lines, which are deliberately constructed to allow for the communication of telephone messages, but unintended act as a receiver for natural radio, an electromagnetic aura, and also provide this image of a continental Aeolian harp capturing the wind in different harmonies across the entire continent. And then as the lines spread across the Atlantic, across the globe, a single Aeolian harp wrapping the earth in sound. I mean, we still have that, right? Although definitely with digital communications, our radio emanations have changed quality, changed volume. But then within this, the earth itself shines. This idea of the lakes of light that Thoreau talks about with those two, with Walden and White Pond, like gems in the earth. To see that, I mean, first you have to envision yourself a mile or so up above so you can see the lakes in the landscape and really get this topographic sense of the space. So you have to be able to envision yourself like a hot air balloon or zeppelin floating above the earth. And then you need to imagine that it isn't water, but that it's light that you're seeing, and that this is light emanating up out of the earth, but also capturing all of the light from the stars and the sun down in. So you have to set aside notions of time. It's like you have to become not a time lapse, but an open shutter, right? Like on an old camera where you're in low light, you need to slow the shutter speed down. If you slow your own shutter speed down to the point where the lakes are filled with the light of eternity, right? It's like I have transduced myself from a physiologically constrained being into sort of a consciousness that floats in a different form of energy. Right? So I am particularly drawn to the analogy of transduction. I'm drawn to the functional and experiential and experimental compositional ideas of transduction between electromagnetism and sound. But separate that part and consider it as a gesture of transduction. That analogy is compelling. Like if we are, for example, transducing electromagnetism into sound, X into Y, if my body and the physiological sensations, the sensorium of energy that I'm physiologically capable of understanding is X prime, then what is Y prime? What has the same relationship to my physiology as sound has to electromagnetism? Or the other way around, if it works better to say sound into electromagnetism, and then the body into what? It's sort of this timeless being, or this raw consciousness, or this broader shutter speed, or this slower photosyncretic shutter where the senses are either removed as their filters or extended to a point where they are meaningful only outside of the scale of our typical lifespan. So I think that's good for this week. Next week I will have an episode, and then I travel to Paris for the opening at the Pompidou, which you would know about if you get my newsletter. So definitely subscribe to the newsletter, ZenGlop.net, and then look for the newsletter link. It's quick and easy to sign up. So there may not be an episode the following week, unless I figure out how to do it in in Reykjavik, because after Paris I'm going to go to Reykjavik. Catherine and I are going to spend a few days in Iceland in January, which should be good, hoping that that will mean we'll see the Northern Lights, which ties in nicely to some of this discussion. Right? The Northern Lights are a visual a visual perception of the electromagnetic activity of the sun and the Earth's. Yeah, I'm not going to get into what the Northern Lights are right now, but hopefully that will be something we see. If not, yeah, it'd be nice to spend some time in Reykjavik, drink some Brennivin. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, drop a note or put a comment, and I will talk to you next week. Keep your wits about you, my friends.